Literature Survey. I want to talk to you about one of the subgenres of African American literature, and that is the slave narrative. And so, in order to understand it, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. That slavery began in this country in 1619 and continued into the 19th century. There are about 600,000 Africans that were brought to this country for the purposes of forced labor. But that 600,000 does not include the countless others that were brought to the Caribbean and to South America for the same purpose. So some of the heavyweights writing in America during this period were Phillis Wheatley, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Jacobs. And so Wheatley doesn't write a slave narrative, but she does express her ideas and her feelings regarding being enslaved in the 18th century America on being brought from Africa to America. She is a cornerstone of African American literature, even though she doesn't write in the genre that I'm talking about, but it is important to talk about what was going on even before the narrative coalesced into kind of a format that we readily recognize today. She was openly questioned in terms of the veracity and authenticity of her poetry by founding father Thomas Jefferson. Now, he had some hypocrisy, obviously, going on with some of the objections that he was raising. He suggested that she couldn't possibly have written the poems that were being presented as hers, and that Black people are capable of emotion, but not of the intellectual rigors that are required of poetic expression and written work. But obviously, from my attitude, because he had an enslaved concubine and had several children by her, I'm not really interested in his opinions about the abilities or capabilities of African Americans. And neither were many of the other authors that we cover in class. Despite his vocal opposition to this possibility, we have so many narratives written by African Americans detailing the horrors of the system of enslavement. So Frederick Douglass probably has the most popular the most popular slave narrative. His is heavily anthologized, especially his scenes with his Aunt Hester and his scenes with Mr. Covey. Both of these scenes are really visceral in terms of the violence that he recounts being witness to or being kind of forced into. And they're both pivotal moments in his journey and maturation process as a slave and as a man. And then the last one that has a lot of, following is Harriet Jacobs, and what she adds to kind of a slave narrative formula is her experiences that are specific based on the fact that she is a woman and has to also contend with sexual exploitation in her experience as an enslaved person. So, but these are just a few. There are many more. Granny Saw, Olaudah Equiano, And the first one, the very, very first one, is Britton Hammond. But these developed past that and gained a lot more popularity. Now, there's a formula for a slave narrative. James Olney, that's Olney, kind of wrote down things that you can expect to see in a narrative, almost to the letter in each one. And the first one that I find most important is the idea that I was born. So many slave narratives start with those three words, I was born. And the reason I think that is so important is because it is asserting my existence. It is asserting that I am here, that I exist, that I'm a person. And that the system of slavery has not taken that from me. So I think that that is so important that so many of the narratives start there. Another point is that there are issues with family in each of these narratives. So, for example, Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington's narratives both attest that they are unsure of who their fathers are. In Douglass's narrative and in Harriet Jacobs' narrative, they talk about being separated from their mothers for long periods of time, either by death or because of the incessant and grueling work of the plantation. So that's in each. Douglass also talks about being unsure of how old he is because the information about birth, etc., are always withheld from slaves. And then there's also the idea of what supplies or what little supplies slaves are given. So there's like an account of how much meat, how many pieces of clothing, how much corn are given per year for their sustenance. And it's usually a meager amount that has to be kind of jealously guarded. But probably most importantly are the scenes of violence, because the point of the slave narrative is to excite empathy and action in the abolitionist audience in the North. And so a recounting of whippings, of different tortures for minor offenses, and of murder are common in slave narratives. They also usually have some kind of gesture toward their escape. But I say gesture because we don't ever get the actual means that an enslaved person receives their freedom or takes self-manumits, so to speak, their freedom back. Because of how many people are usually involved in that process, and because if someone else wants to happen upon the trail that they have blazed, they don't want any subsequent enslaved people to meet with resistance or with people kind of cutting them off of this path to get to freedom. So they don't really go into, I went here, I waited for